Hi, everyone. We're getting started a couple of minutes early. If you just want to let us know where you're tuning in from, I always ask. Yeah, I always like to see where people are watching our programs from. Um, I'm sure we have a lot of people from Connecticut, but if you can tell us where else you are, that'd be great. It looks like we have someone from Pittsburgh this evening, Norwich and Connecticut, Lodi, California. Not sure where that is, but I love geography, so I'll probably look it up later. Um, Syracuse. And I am not at the Twain House. The Twain House is locked up shut for the evening. I am in East Hartford, Connecticut. Um, Farmington, Connecticut. Yeah, let us know where you're coming in from. Looks like we have about 20 people right now. So we're just going to wait a few more seconds for people to arrive. And I'll get started. Someone from Springfield as well. Looks like we have the Northeast mostly covered, Simsbury, Connecticut, but lived in Oneida when I was born. Oh, excellent. Brooklyn, New York. I'll be in Brooklyn later this week. Awesome. Well, it is 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host this program for An Assassin in Utopia, the true story of a 19th-century sex cult and a president's murder. First, I need to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. As a nonprofit organization, the Mark Twain House and Museum depends on contributions to share our enriching author programs like An Assassin in Utopia, education initiatives, and other events with our community. If you can, please consider donating. I'll be providing a link for that in the chat. Now to this evening's program, we are welcoming Susan Wels for discussion with Ellen Wayland-Smith about An Assassin in Utopia, which is a true crime odyssey about a forgotten, astonishing chapter of American history, which leads us from a free love community in upstate New York to the shocking assassination of President James Garfield. Our author, Susan Wels, is a best-selling author, historian, and journalist. Her book, Titanic, Legacy of the World's Greatest Ocean Liner, spent 14 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. The book was also a Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and USA Today bestseller. Wels's work as a historian includes her acclaimed San Francisco Arts for the City, as well as her research on the role of women at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Our moderator, Ellen Wayland-Smith, is an associate professor of writing at the University of Southern California. She is the author of Oneida, From Free Love Utopia to the Well Set Table, and The Angel in the Marketplace, Ad Woman Jean Wayne Rindlaw and the Selling of America. So we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat as Susan and Ellen are having their conversation. If you have a specific question, try to please put that in the Q&A section. If you put it in the chat, it may get lost as we're having conversations in the chat. So just put it in the Q&A section. It's in the bottom center of the screen. It says Q&A and has two word bubbles. You can also please, you can click on captions. I'll actually turn the captions now on my end here, but you can also do that for yourself. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase An Assassin in Utopia through our museum store. Please get this amazing book because your purchase will support our museum and our honored guests as well. So that is all from me. I will turn this over to Susan and Ellen. Enjoy the conversation.
That's better.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Well, yeah, I'll just start by saying a few words about your book, Susan. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here to discuss it with you today. I think we were talking earlier, and I said I had such fun reading it. It was such a fun read. It seems like you had fun researching it. The sort of interlocking stories were entertaining in the best sense. And I guess I wanted to just start off something that I kept sort of circling around when I was reading it was, of course, this strange figure of Guiteau, right? And I noticed when you're describing him in his own words or in the words of people that were close to him, there's often this sense that he's sort of a cipher that he's impersonating. He doesn't know who he is, right? And there's the one quotation where his wife is watching him dress in front of the mirror, and he's trying to look like his desire to look like some of our noted men, she notes. And then, of course, when he at one point, after one of his many failures, you have that chilling quote, "If I cannot get notoriety for good, I will get it for evil." And it just made me think about the whole notion of fame and notoriety, and how, in some sense, the period in which this tale is set is kind of the birth of mass culture with the rise of the penny dreadful, the penny newspapers, the rise of the telegraph, and really sort of a new way of thinking about what it means to be prominent or what it means to gain notoriety. Anyway, that thought just kept coming back to me whenever Guiteau came up. He used to seem so sort of desperate to be noticed, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Absolutely. I sort of think of Charles Guiteau, who was the assassin, the former member of the Oneida Community who went on to assassinate James Garfield, the President of the United States in 1881. I see him as sort of the funhouse mirror reflection of the trends that were going on in certainly antebellum American society. This was the age of the individual, where Horace Greeley, the famous publisher, said, "A man can do pretty much as he pleased." And Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Every reading man has a draft of a new community in his pocket." So where John Humphrey Noyes, the founder of the Oneida Community, went on to actually create his own community, Horace Greeley went on to really create newspaper culture with his newspaper, the New York Tribune, which he founded in 1841. James Garfield, who started from nothing and wanted to live a life with thunder in it. All these people deeply believed that they could create their own destiny. And so did Charles Guiteau, but he was demented. He was demented with a maniacally inflated ego. And so he really was the funhouse mirror reflection of all of these folks.
That's a great metaphor. Yeah, I kept sort of trying to think what the right term was, and that's exactly what he is. He has sort of nothing in and of himself. He reflects all of these distorted sort of currents going on around him. Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind, I thought I would start with a little time travel and give you a taste of what this book is about. We can time travel back to 1869, Oneida, New York, in the first chapter, which is called The Secret History. "It was heaven on earth, and some whispered the devil's garden. Thousands came by trains and carriages to see this infernal Eden carved from hundreds of acres of wild woodland. They marveled at orchards bursting with fruit, thick herds of Ayrshire cattle and Cotswold sheep, whizzing mills and outlandish machinery. They picnicked on spreading lawns, drowsy from plates piled with strawberries and cream, and the sweet, soothing voices of singing children. And they gaped at the people who lived in this place, especially the women, with their queer cropped hair and shamelessly short skirts. The men and women of this strange outpost worked and slept together without sin, they claimed. Dozens of committees ran their farms, stables, silk and trap works, childcare, and education. Their babies were raised in a communal children's house until they were adolescents. Special bonds between parents and children and men and women were banned. Every man was married to every woman, and sex in the Oneida community was a holy practice, the key to spiritual perfection. The tourists in broad bustles and derby hats had heard hushed rumors about these exotic customs. They were eager to see this eccentric society for themselves. In an era so prudish that underclothes were inexpressibles, more than 50,000 visitors swarmed the Oneida community in the 1860s, from church groups and journalists to social reformer Susan B. Anthony and President Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward. The residents greeted sightseers with genteel decorum. Friendly and proper in the public eye, they were seen by locals as generous, industrious, and honest neighbors. Nathan Meeker, a writer for the New York Tribune, spent 3 days in the compound, reporting on its riches, adornment, and every comfort. When he questioned residents about their sexual secrets, they were surprisingly frank and free in their responses. They seemed pleased that I was shocked, he wrote, or that the world would be. Oneidans flaunted their practices in newspapers they sent to subscribers across the country. Their aim was to convert the world, they said, through the explosive power of the press. And their founder, John Humphrey Noyes, documented every detail of his sexual theories. Tall and bearded with a halo of red hair, Noyes was the center of this strange universe. He was a magnetic leader, a born prophet, a missionary in the bone, writer Aldous Huxley later observed. He claimed divine authority over disciples, deciding who would bear children, with whom they would mate, and how. Lovemaking in Oneida was a refined skill that would take its place among the fine arts, he predicted, ranking above music, painting, and sculpture. Like every art, sexual mastery required training. At Oneida, it was the duty of the oldest, most trusted members to teach the youngest. Men as old as 60 instructed the young girls, and boys were intimately tutored by women past menopause. Sex, according to Noyes, was a sacrament, the most exquisite method of communing with God and Christ. Group marriage, he preached, was commanded by Jesus and the apostles. It was a radical theology. Many called it depraved. But Noyes, with his charisma and sexual power, fostered for more than 3 decades the most successful utopian experiment in American history. Still, Oneida's erotic attractions drove hundreds of rogues and misfits to apply for membership. Decades later, some claimed that it planted the seeds of a crime that shook the country to its foundations. So that lays out what this book is about. And I just want to say that I'm so thrilled to be here with Ellen Wayland-Smith, who is actually a descendant of the founders of the Oneida community. So we are very lucky to have Ellen here with us tonight.
Yeah, I was, it's interesting when I was writing my book, I mean, Guiteau, of course, came up, but not sort of central to my story, which was more sort of a history from the origins of the commune through the 20th century and its, its transition into a silverware manufacturing company. But yeah, he left very little sort of trace in the archives. Not that the archives are extensive at Oneida because they burned most of them in 1947, but it was something that I wasn't able to sort of search up at the time, but I'm wondering how you sort of piece together his passage through the Oneida community.
One of the first things I did when I decided to write this book is to go to Syracuse University archives, where the Oneida community papers are held. And I went through lots of boxes and I found a lot of letters that reference Guiteau.
Oh, okay.
And there was a moment in which he was actually trying to blackmail the community after he had left it. And he threatened to go public with their practices, slightly exaggerated, but probably not much.
Right.
And they didn't settle with him, but they threatened to press charges against him. So he dropped his blackmail attempts and fled New York for Chicago. But and the other thing I found was that after Guiteau had been arrested, after he had shot President Garfield, Garfield died in September and Guiteau's trial started in November. John Humphrey Noyes was not subpoenaed, but he wrote a letter of testimony about Charles Guiteau. So that, of course, was also very important. And then, of course, I also found a very obscure newspaper article, an interview with Guiteau's roommate in the Oneida Community, who had been subpoenaed. And the night before he was supposed to go to Washington to show up and testify in federal court, he was oddly arrested with a charge of arson for burning down, supposedly burning down the stables of the Oneida Community. What I was able to find is that in a subsequent article is that it was a hung jury, and it totally seemed to me that he was framed by members of the Oneida Community who really did not want him to go to the federal court and testify about what he experienced from very young childhood, he and his sister growing up in the Oneida Community. So there were lots of bits and pieces that I was able to pull together. And of course, the trial records, all of Guiteau's testimony. There was a tremendous amount in there about his experience in the Oneida Community. So I pulled it all together.
There. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. That was an event, that the burning down of the barn, that I did come across in my research, but, of course, had never put it together that was the sort of precipitating, possibly, event, was to prevent the testimony.
Well, the official story was that he actually did burn down the stables, and that, he got his just desserts and was jailed. But no, I mean, there really wasn't enough evidence to convict him. And I think that it really does point to a framing by the remaining members of the Oneida Community who were concerned about the public relations aspect of this.
Sure, for sure. Interesting. Yeah, and I guess, it makes sense to me, having studied the sort of power structure of the Oneida Community. They were called free lovers. That wasn't their own term, right? That was sort of something that was applied to them from outside, which gives the outsiders gave people the sense that sort of it was willy-nilly, that you could sort of pair up with anybody you wanted, which was not the case, as you sort of indicated in the passage you read, right? It was very sort of strictly structured. All sexual liaisons had to go through a sort of third party. And in the end, it was very much sort of organized to favor the sort of central knot of powerful members. And Guiteau wouldn't have been a part of that inner coterie of people. And so, when he says, there may be many reasons that he didn't find amorous success at the Oneida Community, as he complained, but among them would be that he was really an outsider. And there were many people at the community who had been insiders from the get-go, and there was a very sort of powerful sort of hierarchical structure.
You're absolutely right, of course. And the women in the Oneida Community referred to Guiteau as "get out." That was their name for him. And so that points to the kind of amorous success that he had in the community. And honestly, when he finally left permanently in 1866, he had joined in 1860. That was really the major reason that he left. He just couldn't get any action in the Oneida Community.
Right.
But your point about free love is really interesting and well taken, because John Humphrey Noyes invented the term free love, but love in Oneida was not free, because he had so many prescriptions about how it should be done, how long it should take, whether talking was encouraged or not, although, he loved to talk. I think when he was in the arms of, his niece, who he was having relations with for many years. And his son, Theodore, literally said that sexual control was the basis of John Humphrey Noyes's authority in
right.
the Oneida community. And when he reached his 60s and started to have physical problems, and he started losing his voice, and he was having throat problems, he started losing his sexual charisma, he started losing his control over the Oneida community. So that was really, it was really the core. I mean, sex was the core that held the community together, but it was sex as prescribed by John Humphrey Noyes.
Right, right. Right. And I also, in my book, talked a lot about the eugenics program which they called stirpiculture, where they decided finally in 1869 to start sort of reproducing a new crop of communists. And that also was very orchestrated, right? Especially, from what I was able to sort of read from letters and diaries, and what few sort of sort of official documents were left about that period, having a child with, sort of a woman who was considered desirable was really held out as kind of like a carrot to tempt people into order, men who otherwise might be sort of bucking authority and so forth. So that continued into the reproductive era, which was, but Guiteau had left by then.
Guiteau had left by then, and the stirpiculture experiment, which was the first eugenics experiment in American history, began in the late 1860s and continued into the 1870s. And there were some really remarkable things about it. First of all, it was before the term eugenics even existed. Right. Darwin had published, and Noyes thought, this is kind of interesting, and maybe we take the same process that people are using with animal husbandry and just apply it to humans. And if we can put together the most spiritual, most noise-like people in our community, we can create kind of a super race of spiritually exceptional human beings.
Yeah, right.
What that required in Noyes's mind was what he called breeding in and in. So very much about incest, and he was all for breaking the incest taboo. He thought that getting brothers and sisters together was ideal. That happened in the Oneida community so far as I know, but definitely uncles and nieces. And
yes,
he had this relationship with Tirzah Miller, his niece, and he had a child by her sister, his other niece. Right. So stirpiculture was quite noteworthy. The other thing that was happening is that because the young women were pretty much reserved for the older men in the community, in stirpiculture and pre-stirpiculture, as the young men started to grow into maturity, and they'd sent many of them off to Yale University. They became doctors, they were studying science and reason, and they came back to the community, and first of all, they did not believe anymore that John Humphrey Noyes was God's messenger on earth. And then secondly, they really resented the idea that the young women in the community were reserved for the older men. And so that, combined with John Humphrey Noyes's increasing age, began to collapse the community in the 1870s.
Absolutely. So I wonder if I might just ask you another question, just about biography writing in general. That is, my second book was a biography, and I had so much fun sort of going into the archives and reconstructing these lives from the traces that they had left. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that process was like for you, and also who your favorite character was. Who did you come away with sort of having the most affection for, if anyone? They're all a little bit off.
Well, honestly, I think the character in the book who I have the most affection for and had the most fun with, and biographically probably spent the most time with, Horace Greeley, a character who I never expected to find in this story, but he actually turned out to be kind of the link between Oneida and the assassination of James Garfield. And the reason that was true is that newspapers from the 1830s to the 1860s, they were like the internet of the era. And there was a startup boom in newspapers, and a thought leader emerged, and it was Horace Greeley. And now most of us, I think, only know one thing about Horace Greeley, and that's that he supposedly said, "Go West, young man."
Right.
There was so much more to the story, which I started investigating because his name kept coming up. And the fact is, John Humphrey Noyes was obsessed with Horace Greeley, and his huge goal was to create a daily theocratic newspaper modeled on Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, which he founded in 1841. And before that, he had founded the New Yorker. Anyway, and Guiteau and his funhouse mirror reflection of John Humphrey Noyes also wanted to be as famous as Horace Greeley and start a daily theocratic newspaper, even though he had absolutely no experience in writing or editing. I mean, Noyes at least had started previous newspapers, but Guiteau, he was just trying to be a carbon copy of John Humphrey Noyes. Of course, failed completely. But then in 1867, he actually showed up at Greeley's office asking for a job. Greeley was out. There was no way he was going to get a job. But the pivot point in this story is in 1872, Horace Greeley ran for president of the United States. And Charles Guiteau, who was actually practicing law at the time, decided to drop law and get into politics because he became convinced that if Horace Greeley won the presidential election and went to the White House, he would be so grateful to Charles Guiteau for writing a speech and campaigning for him that he would appoint him as a foreign minister. So Guiteau wrote a horrible speech for Horace Greeley, which he actually gave at a couple of rallies. Horace Greeley lost the election, and actually in a horrendous way, which I recount in the book. But then in 1880, Guiteau rewrote his speech for Horace Greeley as a campaign speech for James Garfield, with the same expectation that if Garfield won the election, he would be so grateful to Charles Guiteau that he would appoint him minister to France, minister to Paris, which didn't happen. And of course, that played into his decision to assassinate the president. But back to Horace Greeley, he was not only a newspaper man, but he also started an incredible number of utopian communities. In the
that was something I had been unaware of until I read your book. Yeah.
And, you know, here's the thing. I mean, this is a book about the assassination of Garfield and about the Oneida community, but it's also about the utopian impulse in American history of this time. You know, between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, there were more than 70 utopian communities that just popped up like mushrooms. It was, as I said, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, every reading man has a draft of a new community in his pocket. And the reason was that the Revolutionary War shattered institutions and traditions, not just politics and government, but religion and social structures. And so charismatic leaders filled the void with all kinds of new experimental social structures. So it was this incredibly fertile time that we've forgotten about. It's not taught in school. And I just felt as a historian that this was a story I really, really wanted to tell. The only thing I can compare it to is probably the 1960s in our own lifetimes, where there was so much ferment and so much social experimentation. But this was happening in pre-Civil War America, and probably to a greater extent than it was in the 1960s, with more outrageous experiments.
Right.
So it was Horace Greeley was right in there. And I should also mention, because this is the Mark Twain House, that in 1867, Horace Greeley hired a 32-year-old writer named Samuel Clemens to be a foreign correspondent. And he went to Europe and the Middle East on a paddle wheeler and started sending columns to Greeley under the byline Mark Twain. And of course, later those columns and the ones he wrote for the Alta California became his first book, Innocents Abroad. Anyway, Horace Greeley is a character we know nothing about, who is really worth knowing. And One other thing that was amazing about Horace Greeley is that his best friend was P.T. Barnum. So that is a whole other story.
That was actually one of my next questions, was that was really something that I was not expecting when I started the book, was the thread of P.T. Barnum just sort of popping up at, repeated intervals throughout the book. He's just always sort of there. And I thought that was so interesting. And I, again, of course, had no idea that he had that connection with Horace Greeley. But yeah, how does the circus fit into this?
I think the circus is kind of a metaphor for American life at the time. There was the utopian impulse, there was the spirit of individualism, and you can create your own destiny. But there was also this impulse for hucksterism and hoaxterism, which P.T. Barnum epitomized. And he really does parade through this book. He's completely unsinkable. And actually, I think if you don't mind, I'll just read
Yes, please.
a couple of pages about P.T. Barnum, his relationship with Horace Greeley, and how he got started. So this is back in 1841. P.T. Barnum and Horace Greeley were both Universalists. And that's how they met. P.T. Barnum was, Phineas Taylor Barnum was his full name, and he was 1 year older than Horace Greeley. Born in Connecticut, Barnum had been named for his grandfather, a practical joker, and he had published a Universalist newspaper in his home state. In 1832, Barnum had been convicted of libeling a deacon in his editorial screeds, and he spent 2 months in the Danbury jail. He soon moved to New York City, where he sold Bibles, ran a grocery store, managed a boarding house, and wrote advertising copy. Emphatic and energetic, with brown curls framing his cherubic features, P.T. Barnum became close friends with Greeley, whom he described as a gangling, wispy-haired, pasty-cheeked man with the face of somebody's favorite grandmother. In 1841, however, Barnum was facing hard times. My recent enterprises, he confessed, had not been productive. It was time for him to make a decisive move. So he purchased a collection of curiosities housed in a 5-story building, a stone's throw from Greeley's office. The huge edifice at the corner of Ann Street and Broadway exhibited stuffed birds and reptiles, wax figures, a live sloth, and a card-playing dog named Apollo. The musty museum had been losing money, but Barnum applied his prodigious marketing talents. He changed the attraction's name to Barnum's American Museum and added mechanical figures, automatons, jugglers, ventriloquists, living statuary, tableaus, dioramas, panoramas, knitting machines, glass blowers, and live snakes, primates, and grizzly bears. He even had a taxidermy shop where customers could drop off their dead pets and pick them up a few hours later, stuffed and mounted. His museum opened on New Year's Day, 1842, and one of his first major exhibits was a great model of Niagara Falls with real water. Hundreds of honeymooners and others who could not afford to travel to Niagara flocked to the attraction, only to discover that the model was just 18 inches tall. I felt considerably sheepish about it, Barnum admitted, but they had the whole museum to fall back on for 25 cents. His patrons could also ogle unusual human beings, such as Charles Stratton, a 4-year-old prodigy who had only grown 1 inch since he was 6 months old. Stratton was just over 2 feet tall and weighed 15 pounds, and Barnum first introduced him as General Tom Thumb on Thanksgiving Day, 1842. He mendaciously said that the tot was 11 years old, and the tiny, precocious performer charmed customers with his singing, acting, and comic timing. He was so small that Barnum could easily hold him in the palm of his hand or hide him in his coat pocket. It was a great act, Stratton later recalled, and the crowds loved it. Barnum was a master at capturing public attention. He draped the museum with billowing banners and stationed powerful floodlights on the roof. On a 3rd-floor balcony overlooking the street, he seated a brass band, the worst musicians he could find, to raucously serenade the crowds and drive them out of earshot into the building. Inside, they would enter a great hall filled with grotesque creatures and relics, including moldy panoramas and small, dilapidated models of the world's great cities. When they reached the roof, which Barnum advertised as a restful garden, they would find a couple of stunted cedar trees and some wilted flowers. Barnum was the first to admit that he was a con man, a prince of trickery and deceit, but the public applauded his shameless hoaxes. The novelist Henry James and thousands of other New Yorkers loved losing themselves for hours on end in his garish, bewitching, dusty halls of humbug.
Great. Also, it reminded me that Henry James, in his novel, The Bostonians, he writes about a mesmerist, right? So mesmerism, again, the idea that you can sort of read people's minds, go into a trance and either communicate with the dead or read people's minds, was a great parlor trick and sort of fully in keeping with the Barnum style spectacle. But Henry James in The Bostonians paints this character of a sort of spiritual guru who puts his beautiful daughter, Verena Tarrant, into a trance, and she sort of spills forth feminist diatribes. This is, sort of post Seneca Falls, when women's rights is in the air. And in any case, he modeled this a sort of horrible huckster on John Humphrey Noyes.
Well, interestingly,
Yeah.
Henry James's father,
Right,
knew John Humphrey Noyes and visited him frequently. I mean, John Humphrey Noyes in around 1850 created a satellite of the community in Brooklyn,
right.
New York,
Brooklyn.
because it was closer to telegraphs and steamships. And again, he was all about the newspaper,
Right.
and sending his newspaper about the Oneida community out to everybody.
Mhm.
So Henry James visited him frequently. Henry James Sr. visited him frequently at Willow Place in Brooklyn, and encouraged him in his theology and wanted him to spread it as widely as possible.
Oh.
So his son, Henry James, the novelist, knew about it and
Known about it, right?
obviously adopted the model.
Yeah, right.
The novel.
But a little less, a little less admiration than his father.
Yes.
He's clearly interesting. And so, speaking of, the sort of circus of it all, what was it that drew you to this topic to begin with? What did you think once you got in and sort of discovered that the story was so much sort of more entangled than you had first suspected, I imagine?
Well, I first stumbled on the Oneida Community when I was a graduate student in history, and I read about it, and I could not believe what I was reading. I mean, I felt like my jaw was dragging on the floor, because what they were doing in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and 70s in Victorian America, if it was happening today, I think we would all be beyond shocked. It was really quite incredible. I didn't know about it. Nobody I knew about it. I just thought, because I'm a writer, this is something I would love to write about at some point. But I didn't want to write an academic book. There have been plenty of wonderful books written about the Oneida community, including yours, Ellen. But I thought if I could find a crime that was committed by somebody in the Oneida community, that would give me a human interest way into the story. Mm-hmm. The problem was I could not find a crime, because as eccentric as their practices were, they were considered pillars of the community. They were beloved by their neighbors. Nobody ever did anything wrong, wink, wink. And I was just kind of hitting one brick wall after another. So this is back in 2009, and I knew that the New York Times had recently put their archives online. And I thought, as a last-ditch effort, there was a minute chance that if a crime had been committed in upstate New York, that the New York Times would have reported on it. So I literally typed into the search bar, Oneida Community crime. And all of a sudden I got an avalanche of hits. It was a tidal wave, so many that I couldn't even focus on what they were about. And when I kind of caught my breath, calmed down, and started reading, it was a presidential assassination. And literally at that moment, I knew I had a book, but I also knew that I had a tremendous amount of work in front of me, because it was a much bigger crime than I ever expected to find. I was thinking maybe a robbery or a murder or something like that, but not a presidential assassination. And that really enlarged, by a huge amount, the scope of the book and the amount of research and the kind of research I was doing, which now had to include all of the politics of the time and the presidential histories and all of that. So it took me, more than 12 years to research and write this book.
Right. Yeah, well, it definitely shows in the intricacy of the stories and their sort of interwebbing. Yeah. And so I also love, I thought you did such a beautiful way of closing out the story with the sort of the scene of falls, basically. I mean, first of all, the Niagara Falls closes the story because John Humphrey Noyes dies after he sort of exiles himself from the Oneida Community at the collapse, and he goes north to Canada to escape the authorities who he thought were on his tail. And so he dies beside Niagara Falls in what they called the Stone Cottage. And then, of course, there's the fall of Guiteau through the trapdoor as he's hanged. And then you add this incredible anecdote about the Brooklyn Bridge jumper, someone who jumps from Brooklyn Bridge to see, as a stunt, right, a sort of Barnum style stunt, to see if he could survive, which he doesn't. But I loved how you brought those three sort of falls together at the end, and I wondered if how you thought about sort of closing out the story, and if I'm reading too much into it, or if there's sort of a significance to that conjunction.
Bless you for noticing that. No, it was very deliberate. Honestly, I kind of had the first line and the last line of the book before I wrote anything else. And the reason why I knew the last line of the book and that it was going to be at Niagara Falls is Niagara Falls is just kind of a recurring theme in this book. It just keeps popping up. When John Humphrey Noyes decided to go to theology school at Yale University, his mentor said, follow your faith, even if it carries you over Niagara Falls.
Right.
And of course, we already heard the anecdote about P.T. Barnum and Niagara Falls, right?
Right.
And then one of the practices in the Oneida Community,
Forgot about that.
Men were not allowed to climax. And John Humphrey Noyes described it as a boatman approaching the falls,
Right.
Learns how to stay in the area of easy rowing. And that's how he described this sexual practice, and not going over the falls.
Right.
And then, of course, at the end of the book, he's living at Niagara Falls and dies there. So yes, it was very deliberate. It was something that I personally loved about the story. And I'm so glad you noticed it. Thank you.
But also weaving in that sort of fad there was at that time for jumping off of bridges as
Yes.
sort of a Guinness World Book of Records thing, which again circles back to this idea of notoriety and what counts as fame, and the sort of idea everybody gets their 15 minutes.
And also, because so many of the characters in this book cross paths. And so the guy who jumped off the falls actually taught swimming to the children of presidents of the United States. And James Garfield's wife, the first lady, went to the opening of his big swimming pool in Washington, D.C. So I mentioned that in the course of talking about their first months in the White House. And he goes on not only to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge, but to open a museum that shows macabre relics from Guiteau's hanging, including the hangman's rope. So He kind of ties into all of it, and also with the P.T. Barnum-esque showmanship. And in fact, P.T. Barnum had his elephants going across the Brooklyn Bridge when it first opened. So that was sort of P.T. Barnum's exit from the story. That was the last appearance. But it all ties together in this crazy way.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, just even the idea of a fall, with all of its sort of theological implications or, moral implications, do you have a sense of, not that you can sort of draw a conclusion or pass judgment on the various, necessarily the various things that the various escapades that happen in this book, but I got a sense that it was also, sort of trying, the utopian impulse sometimes leads to danger or to destruction.
Yeah, pretty much everybody in this story has a good side and a bad side, including John Humphrey Noyes, including, well, maybe not Guiteau, but definitely Horace Greeley, P.T. Barnum. I mean, all these folks have a fall.
Right.
And James Garfield as well. He has his faults as well. So I think it's just maybe a little more realistic portrait of the time and these people than we typically get. It's sort of, I think of it as misfit history, the offbeat underside of the American story, but it's not intended to glorify anybody, present them heroically. It doesn't fit into the traditional narratives, but this is what I found as a historian really went on, and I was beyond fascinated with it. It just kept me engrossed and entertained for more than 12 years, and I really hope other people enjoy it too.
Yeah. Do you want to read the final passage that you were going to, or?
I could, sure, unless Oscar wants us to move on to questions.
Okay. Yeah.
But the book ends before John Humphrey Noyes dies with a little bit about what happened to Guiteau's body after he was hanged, and this was also a huge surprise for me. Guiteau's corpse was quickly taken out of its cheap coffin so that doctors from the Army Medical Museum could conduct an autopsy. His lawyer had hoped to take possession of the body, freeze it, and exhibit it around the country. A little bit of Barnum there. But the Army took charge of it. The doctors removed the assassin's spleen, which was greatly enlarged from chronic malaria, along with several pieces of his brain. They planned to preserve those relics for the museum's historical and educational collection, which also included 3 vertebrae from the cadaver of John Wilkes Booth. The rest of the assassin's body was thrown into a huge boiler, where, according to the Columbia, South Carolina state, it was allowed to boil and bubble until all the flesh had fallen from his skeleton. The bones were then picked out, bleached, and also prepared for exhibit at the museum. The assassin's head, however, received special treatment. The skin on the skull, including Guiteau's face, was preserved in alcohol and then stuffed so skillfully, according to the Cleveland Leader, that it looked just like the living assassin, with the scraggly beard, scar on the scalp, and even marks on his neck from the hangman's rope. The Army's official anatomist then preserved the stuffed head in a clear 8-inch by 12-inch glass jar. For many months, according to the New York Herald, the doctors had it on exhibition for the gratification of curious friends. In 1887, however, Guiteau's head, his stuffed head, came into the possession of an impresario, Professor E.M. Worth, who was known in New York as the founder of Worth's Museum and Congress of Living and Inanimate Curiosities. Worth took Guiteau's head on tour, along with a monster devilfish and transparent baby, before showcasing it in 1908 as a permanent exhibit in his Indiana museum. In September 1916, however, the museum, with Guiteau's face and thousands of other curiosities, burned down to the ground. The assassin's skeleton, meanwhile, remained in the Army Medical Museum. A portion of his brain still resides in Philadelphia's Mutter Museum, along with the brain of Albert Einstein and the livers of Chang and Eng, famous conjoined twins who toured with P.T. Barnum. And that's why I love history. You can't make this stuff up.
Right.
So do we have any questions? I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
Yeah, hi. Looks like we have one question from Bethany. Well, first she says, what a fascinating time in history. And her question is, what information surprised you most in your research for the book?
Well, probably that last bit I read about Guiteau's face surprised me the most. I mean, I was really not expecting that. But there were just so many surprises, and I found myself just honestly completely entertained by this tale as I was writing it. I mean, in every chapter, there were things that astonished me, and I hope they astonish you too.
Yes, I've been listening, and it's been this one astonishment after another. Does anyone else have any more questions? We have a few more minutes for questions. Please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Okay, it looks like Patrick is wondering, if the records of the community were destroyed in 1947, how did you conduct your research?
Well, as I say, the community's papers, the ones that exist, are at Syracuse University in their archives. And, there aren't masses of them, but there are lots of letters. And so I was able to look at those. And of course, the trial transcript and, testimony and writings of other people. There have been lots of great books written about the Oneida community, a lot of memoirs written by former members of the Oneida community. So there was actually a pretty good wealth of documentation.
And
I wish they hadn't been burned. We would have had a lot more to work with.
But they of course too were, in keeping with what you've been talking about, Susan, and their obsession with publishing. I mean, they wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of pages during the 30 years that they were in existence, and published it, as a newsletter called The Circular. And so, you're getting a one-sided story from their own, sort of home newspaper, but so much about their practices and what they were up to just sort of on a day-to-day basis, and their theories, all their theology are in these published circulars. And so when I did my research, I drew a lot from the circular.
Yeah, they love to write and report on what they did. And there was even a relative of John Humphrey Noyes, who was a gynecologist, who reported on, all of their sexual practices in great detail. So there's a pretty rich archive there.
Judy says, Guiteau was so garbled, he was completely unsuccessful as a lawyer. Even his family described him as insane. But Dr. John Gray and others argued successfully he was not. What do you think?
I'm not a lawyer, and I really can't talk about, whether he was truly insane or not. I think he was, I do think he was nuts. He was demented. Whether dementia constitutes insanity, I don't know. But he was not a normal guy.
Yeah. And there's a question about Dawn asked, I already purchased your book. Glad I did. What is your next topic?
Oh boy. Well, I'm looking at another story of connections and unreported history. And it takes place in Napoleonic Europe. So we'll see if that actually turns into a book, but I've got a lot of really interesting research in front of me.
Great. Well, that's an exciting little nugget. We'll be on the lookout for that one. Any last questions from the audience? Ellen, do you have any last questions before we close things out?
No, just want to thank you all for a wonderful conversation. I so enjoyed it and learned so much. Thank you, Susan.
Well, I've totally enjoyed being here, and thank you, Oscar, for inviting us.
Yes, thank you, Oscar.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So we'll close things out. Thanks again to Susan and Ellen. Thanks to our audience as well. Please join us for future programs. On Thursday, this Thursday, we'll be talking to the author of After the Miracle, The Political Crusades of Helen Keller. And on April 25th, we'll have 2 author programs. The first is for a book called The Unsealing: Love, Lust, and Murder in the Gilded Age. And then later that same day, we'll have the author of The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho. That will be a hybrid event, so you can come to the museum or you can see it online. Charles Ignatius Sancho, that book is based on a true story of a Black Briton who lived in 18th century London. Very exciting for our programs that are coming up. And finally, please join us at the museum for a tour. We're open 6 days a week. And you can visit our brand new exhibit For Business or Pleasure, Twain's Summer Sojourns, which focuses on the Clemens family's American summer vacations between 1870 and 1910. So that is all. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye.